Dr. Deborah Delayne. She's an associate professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where she mentors graduate and undergraduate students working on various aspects of pollinator health and productivity. She adores teaching and currently teaches insect and society, aquatic entomology, bridging art and science through environmental communications, growing future naturalist, and insect pest management. She has over 30 years of experience working with pollinators and specifically honeybees and maintaining between 50 and 100 colonies in and throughout Delaware, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. Her research program has 4 main focus areas. Number 1, genetic identity and diversity of U.S. honeybees. Number 2, temporal stability of pollinator populations. Number 3, best management solutions for creating sustainable managed pollinator populations. And number 4, pollinator nutrition and forage mapping. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Deborah Delayne.
We're going to talk about what we know about what bees eat and kind of go through studies past, present, and future. Because this is a really important topic. If you're a beekeeper, just like with anything, you need to know to steward it the best and take care of it and help it in the best way possible. What are the best things to feed your honeybees, or at least position your honeybees to be able to feed on? So let's take a look at the next slide. I'm trying to get it to go. Okay, here we go. And talk about the honeybee diet. Honeybees have a very specialized diet. They actually are vegetarians in some ways, meaning that they feed on nectar and pollen. There is some research that's showing that they also feed on a lot of microbes. So this idea of strictly a vegetarian diet is in question. But we do know that they collect floral rewards and they process these and they turn them into stored proteins and stored carbohydrates in the colony. Now, there's been tons of work done on nutritional stress and problems that are occurring to honeybee populations. And what we know is that nutritional stress and disease kind of feed off of each other. If we look at this diagram here, you can see nutritional resilience. Nutrition is very important in improving the health of a honeybee population. And so improved forage, improved feed that's diverse, that has all of the different nutrients that a honeybee colony needs, is going to go a long way in helping to increase the health of that colony and help to reduce pathogens and also other things that can affect the honeybee immune system, from the individual honeybee to colony health. So poor nutrition, we know, is linked to increased susceptibility to viruses and fungal pathogens, as well as bee pathogens have a detrimental effect on nutritional physiology. If we look at things like the microsporidians, like nosema, those we know have a significant effect on the gut and how bees are able to assimilate nutrients from their foods. So interactions create feedbacks that can harm bee health, especially if bees are put into areas to forage where there is either not a lot of diversity or high quality feed, or even possibly toxic feed. Now, if we look at and break down what honeybees need to survive, we can start by looking at carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are required by both adult and larval stages for normal growth and development, and also wax production. And also very important in a perennial colony is thermoregulation. All of those carbohydrates help fuel important things like wing muscles that help to generate heat, that help to keep the internal temperature and homeostasis of a colony consistent, the relative humidity as well as the temperature, so that the bees are kept at their optimal temperature. Now, nectar comes mostly from these nectaries, and this is actually a tulip poplar flower. That's really common around where I live, probably also up in Ohio, I would think. And you can see the ladybird beetle feeding on this glistening area right here, which is the nectary of the tulip poplar flower. And tulip poplar flowers produce a lot of nectar. That's one of the main nectar flows that we have here in southern Pennsylvania, southeastern Pennsylvania. And that's primarily probably our biggest honey contributor besides black locust. And nectaries are extremely diverse. This is just within the Fritillaria species. So this genus here, and you can see the position, the shape of this nectary is quite different. Depending from a long slit-like structure, it's the black area here, to a very long slit-like structure, to a very tiny one at the base. So this is just within a particular genus. So this is a very, very diverse structure that is producing this kind of persuasive reward for insect visitors, not even just insects, but flower visitors to come and investigate the flower and hopefully maybe get some pollen on them and transfer that for pollination services. Now, if we look at this Helleborus species, their petals are actually here in green, and they're modified into these kind of cone-like structures that hold the nectar. So these petals are modified into nectaries. Quite beautiful structure, actually. These are actually not the petals, the true petals. These are the sepals, but these are the petals here. So this Helleborus shows you a very different kind of adaptation and variation in nectar and nectary location. And of course, we inadvertently supply things that are nectar-like. Probably not the healthiest thing for the bees to collect, but it's sweet, it's sugary, it has sucrose in it, and these bees are going to definitely, if there's nothing else available, going to visit any type of soda pop. Now, if we look at nectar in terms of the carbohydrates, not all nectar is made equal. Sugar content can vary from 4% to 60%. Studies in the 1970s found that sugar solutions between about 30 to 15%, 50%, elicit a very good collection response where bees will recruit to that source. Sucrose, glucose, and fructose are usually the main sugars identified in nectar. And there is a preference even among the sugars themselves, which we'll talk about. Now, honey is kind of the later state. And so this is nectar that has been enzymatically converted, where the sucrose is changed to fructose and glucose. And 99.9% of the solids in honey are sugars. Very sweet substance. And very yummy. So in these studies by Waller in the 1970s, he actually looked at sugar preferences with honeybees and provided these different types of sugar: sucrose, glucose, maltose, and fructose. And you can see the preference was in order as they're listed here. Sucrose is preferred in choice tests by honeybees. And there was other studies done in the 70s by Berker and Lerner where they found that sucrose was better than other sugars in terms of nutritive value. So when they fed these different types of sugars to bees in the lab, they actually lived longer and had were healthier, larger in size, etc. So pretty interesting work. Now, a more recent study, this is from 2018, this study, honeybees were fed supplemental carbs, and the treatments were honey, sucrose, high fructose corn syrup, and then a mixture of high fructose corn syrup and pollen. So different colonies were fed these different types of things. So a certain group of colonies were just fed honey, a certain group of colonies were just fed sucrose, and so on and so forth. And then they were exposed to different types of stressors. And in this study, it was temperature stress, and also another stressor was chemical stress, specifically the imidacloprid, which is a type of neonicotinoid. And what they found in this study, that mortality was greatest for bees fed sucrose exposed to imidacloprid. So really this stressor of the midichloprid really had the highest mortality impact on these honeybee colonies. Now, this other study done in 2019, this was a small sample size, but I think it's interesting to see that they looked at overwintered colonies that were fed honey, some of them. Some of them were fed sugar, a 3-to-2 solution. Some were fed inverted sucrose syrup, and some were fed wheat and starch syrup. And then they wanted to look at, okay, if they fed these colonies, these different feeds for winter, how would that affect Nosema ceranae? And they were able to confirm the presence or non-presence of Nosema ceranae with the use of PCR, molecular tools. And what they found is that honey-fed colonies had the least amount of this Nosema ceranae. However, wheat starch colonies had the highest reduction in fitness and a higher prevalence of nosematosis. So you can see here that what type of carb, what kind of sugar source, carbohydrate source you are feeding to the bees is going to have an effect on colony survival and also in how they respond to different types of pathogens. All right, so even looking at other things present in nectar, there's different phytochemicals in nectar, and they can also impact pollinator health in good ways and bad ways. There's certain ones that can benefit by reducing viral loads. We've probably heard of those types of foods for us, where they might have some type of viral, antiviral effect on us. Well, same goes for honeybees. That can happen by increasing antimicrobial peptide expression, which happens in the fat body. Also involved is our hemocytes and the hemolymph. Also increased longevity. So reduced Nosema ceranae spore load. There's 2 different studies that kind of looked at these phytochemicals, one by Palmer and Young et al. 2017, and another one by Bernklau in 2019. Here is another interesting study from 2019, looking at nectar foraging preferences dependent on sugar concentration. So sucrose being the preferred sugar, and also, and this is interesting, looking specifically at amino acid composition. And these particular ones, phenylalanine and glycine, were seen to be having an effect on foraging preferences. So honeybee foragers actually showed a preference for amino acids, and it showed this kind of phagostimulatory effect where they actually went back to feed, and they'll actually sacrifice carbohydrates for amino acids in nectar. So concentration, even if it's just sucrose at high concentration, if there's sucrose with amino acids added, they'll prefer the amino acid added to the sucrose than just the plain sucrose. So very interesting to see that they are looking for other ingredients within their carbohydrate source. Now, there's tons of different ways to feed your bees, and I can show you kind of different ways. I can also tell you how we do it at the University of Delaware. But feeding your bees is something that you probably at some point are going to have to do, especially if you need to feed them up to make it through winter time, or maybe to just jumpstart a colony, especially if you want to provide a very strong pollination colony. You want them to be up to size, so you might have to stimulate them to increase their population. And there's all different ways to do this. We actually do hand feeding at the University of Delaware. So we just put a little bit of honey in our hand, and then we just kind of let them come. And I'm totally joking. That would make absolutely no sense. I'm just trying to break things up. Maybe stretch your legs, stretch your arms. I'm going to, and we'll move on. Now, in terms of fall feeding, leaving honey on is best, of course. But if you're like me, sometimes every now and then you might take a little too much, or you might not understand weather patterns, and maybe you took more than you should, considering the weather was awful, etc. And they just sat in there and engorged themselves on honey faster than you thought they would. But you need to get the colony up to weight. That is important. That is your responsibility to make sure that they have enough food going into winter. So a thicker syrup, generally a 2-to-1, and really you have to pay attention to the temperature. You must switch from liquid feed once the temperature drops consistently below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, this is a bucket feeder placed on top of the inner cover. This is one way to do it. And the last thing you want to see is this in early March, or maybe even a warm day in late February, where you see the bees, their heads are in the cells and they just ran out of food. Or there might be honey in the colony, but the cluster isn't where the honey is. And it was too cold for them to be able to move over to where the honey was. And what this is winter non-survival, it's starvation. So there are ways to kind of rescue your bees. If you lift them, say January, February, and you feel that they are not heavy enough, and you're worried that they're not going to have enough food to get through to the springtime, to the first nectar production, then you can do a winter rescue. There's a couple different ways to do it. Here's one where you're just pouring sugar either on the top bar, or on the inner cover, or you can put newspaper down and actually place, put a couple slits and pour sugar right on top of that. It'll kind of get condensated and harden over time, and the bees will be able to utilize it. You can also make a candy board. You can see the wire under here and this kind of hardened sugar mixture. And I also know people who use fondant. So if temperatures allow, you can do a liquid feed, but you want to do a thinner syrup in the springtime. So early spring feed, you can do fondant. If the temperatures are good, you can do a 1-to-1. You can also spray a sugar water on the cells. That's not going to last as long. It's not going to really help if they absolutely have no more food. So you really want to think about one of the other alternatives I mentioned. And I just thought that cake was absolutely adorable. All right. So nectar and honey requirements. Of course, this is going to have a lot of different variables affecting what your nectar and honey requirements should be. So colony strength being one of them, availability and types of plants in your area, and if they produce lots of nectar, also the weather. Even an area that normally has a lot of nectar producing plants could have strange weather, and then maybe the plants aren't nectaring that particular year. I can tell you by me, the black locust doesn't nectar every year. And so I can't necessarily depend upon the black locust here where I am in northern Delaware. So generally, we say for our area, about 50 to 80 pounds of honey per colony from the time brood rearing ends in the fall until the spring nectar flow. Now, summer requirements, most people don't think about, but they also require lots of nectar. They're busy in the summertime. So they are constantly going to be bringing in nectar and, processing it into honey, but they're also going to be utilizing that as food. So total requirements for the whole year is about 150 to 170 pounds. But we normally really think about it during that preparation for wintertime, making sure they have at least 50 to 80 pounds. Now, kind of switching gears to talk about pollen and bee bread. Now, I like this picture because it's kind of a transition. You can see this more chalky colored pollen here, bee collected pollen. And then you can see this almost shiny jellyish looking. And this is what we would call bee bread. This is actually chemically different than, say, this flower bee collected pollen here. This is in a transition period, and we'll talk about what those differences are. But I can tell you that pollen and bee bread is the main protein source for a honeybee colony. And protein is absolutely essential, just like for us and all other organisms, for development of muscles, body tissues, glands. All of these things absolutely are necessary, and protein is necessary for them to happen. So specific amino acids are actually needed to create larval food and to ensure the growth, and I'm not talking just the growth, but the optimal growth of young adult bees. And also protein and amino acids from pollen is really important for the production of eggs in queens, and is linked to kind of the vitellogenin, which is very important in egg production in honeybee queens. Now, if we look at some interesting information here, this is actually a picture of the fat body. This is from Sam Ramsey. But adult bees about 42 to 52 hours and up to 5 days binge on pollen. And this actually helps to develop their fat bodies, which is a really important kind of diffuse internal organ that actually has an important function in immunity. And specifically the humoral immune response. So we're learning more and more of how important this fat body is and how it's affected by different pathogens like varroa mites, et cetera. So protein's really essential in developing this important organ. Now, also right here, this is actually the hypopharyngeal gland, which is located in the head of the adult honeybee. And this is it pulled out. So it kind of looks like this long string of little beads. And really what I want you to see is this diversity of proteins expressed in the hypopharyngeal gland. And the hypopharyngeal gland is one of the glands, as well as the mandibular gland, that are used to produce secretions to make brewed food or bee milk, or there's all sorts of names for it. And so this is what's fed to the babies as larvae through their different larval instars in order to develop into a pupa and finally, eventually into an adult. So very, very important. So these nurse bees, once they emerge as adults, they're going to become these nurse bees. They're going to binge on pollen. They're going to be getting all of this wonderful proteins and amino acids from the pollen that they're eating. And then they're going to be making this brewed food and giving it to the young bees. Now, there's also many factors that affect the nutritive quality of pollen. Not all pollen is made equal either. And temperature, soil moisture, pH, different soil applications even can affect different characteristics of pollen, from the size of the pollen to even nutritional value. So protein levels can vary from pollen of different plants, and it can range from 8 to 40%. And so not only that, we also have or know that there are even the same plant actually produced and under different microclimatic regimens can actually have different pollen attributes. So say a dandelion grown here in the mid-Atlantic and a dandelion grown more northern, say in Ohio, even though they're the same species, because they are grown in different soils, they can have, their pollen can actually have different attributes nutritionally. So another amazing thing about pollen is that they actually contain all the essential amino acids. This was work done in the 1950s. You can see the list here. We're starting to learn more and more about which ones are important to honeybees and specifically to honeybee growth and development. And here's a study from 2019 where they actually looked at the effects of amino acid supplementation. So they supplemented colonies with amino acids, and then they looked at different measures. So they had caged bees that were fed amino acids, and they found that the ones that were fed these amino acids compared to ones that were not fed them had head weights similar to nurse bees. Remember, the nurse bees are the ones whose mandibular glands and hypopharyngeal glands are fully functioning, operating, and producing that brewed food. They also found that caged bees that were fed these amino acids developed thorax weights, where their wings and legs are attached, similar to foragers. Right. Also, they found that poor nutrition, so bees that weren't fed high quality diets, could be remedied with feeding essential amino acids. So a lot of really interesting things here. These graphs down here kind of show those things that I just talked about. So no essential amino acids and essential amino acids here. You can see that this kind of led to this body weight that was more typical in a nurse bee, heads that were more typical in size of nurse bees, thoraxes here, again, increased with essential amino acids, as well as the abdomens too. So nutrition drives colony growth via the nurse bees, right? Colonies with heavy nurse bees rear more brood. So I hope you can see the connection here. So this hasn't necessarily, as far as I know, been marketed yet into a particular product, but this is interesting to understand how this essential amino acid supplementation can kind of change the dynamics of a colony. Look at this, 17% increase in nurse bee weight corresponded to 100% more capped brood cells. So this idea that essential amino acids helps to create this kind of larger bee, more similar to these nurse bees that are heavier, that have larger glands, larger thoraces, etc., and increased brood. Now we have to talk about lipids, fats, and sterols. And just like for us, there's a lot of good lipids, fats, and sterols, and they're absolutely required for a healthy developing honeybee. Needed for energy, also needed for the synthesis of reserves in the fat body. The fat body not only plays an important part in humoral immunity in the honeybee, but also for storing metabolic energy. And also a structural component of cell membranes, especially the fats and the lipids, and lubrication of food as the honeybee is processing it through its digestive tract. So pollen and lipid content also varies depending on the pollen. But lipids are found in most pollens. And actually, it's the outer portion of the pollen grain that's usually associated or contains the lipids, and it has an odor. So this is a very important part of the pollen grain because that's what's going to attract the bee or any kind of pollen eater to that particular flower to collect that pollen. If we look at dandelion, they have about 14.4% lipids, mustard about 13%. And honeybees require cholesterol also. And they found that honeybees, specifically the 24-methylene cholesterol, is normal and is required for growth and development. And what's so important about the sterols is that these are precursors for hormones. And it's the hormones in all insects that cause bees or allow bees to grow and be able to molt from one instar to the next and shed that previous instar or larval exoskeleton. So without this cholesterol, they wouldn't be able to have the hormone development that would then be released to trigger this molting process. And these sterols are also found in pollen. Oops, wrong way. So there's different types of sterols associated with insects. There's cholesterol, there's campestrol, cystosterol, stigmasterol. And really what we've seen with honeybees, and this is from 1980, is that diet supplemented with this 24-methylene cholesterol supported large amounts of sealed brood. And that makes sense considering the importance of these sterols in initiating the molting process because of their importance to hormone development. Vitamins are also super important for honeybee diet. They can get the vitamins from pollen as well. And pollen, different proteins that have been identified in pollen are B complex vitamins. And they're really, really important for hypopharyngeal gland development, also important for the queen in terms of egg laying. And all of the essential minerals are also found in pollen. And these are extremely important for helping the bees maintain enzymes. And they're also just different types of membrane and ion transfer systems within the honeybee body. So the major minerals found in the 3 body regions of the adult bee, as well as royal jelly, are, you would probably guess these: potassium, sodium, magnesium, and phosphorus. And it's also shown that bees, generally the minerals decline with age, just like us. So we often don't think about annual requirements of pollen unless you're in an area where you have a pollen dearth, where their pollen is limited. I've lived in a place like that once in my life. And in Eastern Washington, we did not have quite the pollen supply that we have here in the Mid-Atlantic. And really, I don't have to worry about pollen limitation here. But we generally can look to some old studies and see that about 44 to 66 pounds, 88 pounds. So there is a requirement, because this pollen is what helps to create not only the important proteins and things that queens need in order to lay eggs, but also the important brood food that nurse bees actually make to feed the babies, and then also the development of the different instars and the molting in the honeybees themselves. All right, so I've done a little work trying to understand what bees eat in my particular area, and how we did this was we developed a forage calendar. And you can see here, we simply just put some pollen traps on the front of the colonies here. And how these pollen traps work, if you haven't worked with them before, the entrances are right here, and the bees are forced to fly through these little tiny squares. And as they're flying through the squares, the pollen gets dislodged off their leg. And it falls into this collection tray underneath. So by doing that every week for one day in 2016, from March till September, we could see kind of an idea of what bees were feeding on in this area where we were doing this, in this one particular apiary. And we could develop somewhat of a forage calendar for our bees, understanding which pollens were really important. The main thing that sticks out to me is the importance of maple pollen early on in the spring in terms of jumpstarting our colonies and really signaling to the queen to start egg laying. Now, there are places where maybe you have to feed pollen. I recommend, if you can, feeding actual pollen over supplements, just because it's really hard for us to recreate the kind of pollen and the evolutionary ingredients and an amazing little structure that pollen is, that bees have evolved to digest and ferment and process into bee bread. But if in doubt, there are different feeding supplements out there. But typically how you feed pollen, you can feed it in a bucket, you can feed it in these little tubes, you can do different types of pollen patties that you can put right on the top bar. And when do you want to do it? Typically in the spring, to kind of jumpstart the queen to start laying eggs. And it's when you want the colony to grow in size, because like I said, pollen equals protein, which equals bees. So if you run a bunch of colonies for pollination purposes, then you're going to want to make sure that they have an adequate supply of pollen in the spring, so you can get your colonies up to size for your pollination contracts. I'm going to talk to you about a couple different studies looking at pollen supplements. This is the effects of supplemental pollen feeding on honeybee colony strength, specifically also looking at nosema infection. This was done in 2019, and they used 75 colonies. They had 6 treatments within the 75 colonies. So some colonies had no supplemental feed, and the others had 4 commercial supplements. And the 6th one was a wildflower pollen. So one was a control with no supplemental feed. Then there were 4 that were just 4 different commercial types of supplements. And then the 6th one was a wildflower pollen. And they looked at adult bees, they looked at capped brood, and they also looked at nosema intensity. And they looked at these types of variables 4 weeks before and 4 weeks after they were fed these, and then 8 weeks after they were fed. So there was no changes in colony metrics or decrease in nosema intensity for this particular study. There was no clear signal of the impact of diet supplementation on any of these variables. And that just goes to show you that in some cases, they might be feeding them to them, but they could also be bringing other things in. So this type of work can be really tricky out in the field unless you're completely limiting the bees just to one particular source. Now, this is a really interesting study done by Dolzel in 2019, looking at interacting stressors and diet quality, virus infection, and honeybee health. And I like this study because they did a laboratory cage experiment, but then they also followed it up with nuke field experiments. So you're getting kind of this lab, kind of not like ideal realistic kind of look, but you're able to control variables, and then you can bring it out in the field. And what the study showed was in the lab that high quality diets, so diets that were high in protein, polyfloral, high in crude protein, et cetera, can reduce mortality in honeybees that are inoculated with the IAPV virus. Now, this is pretty cool because this suggests that nutrition or diets can help bees fight infections and viral infections, which is pretty awesome. Now, the nuke field studies actually demonstrated that bees starved of pollen and infected with IAPV would abscond, which makes kind of sense. Okay, they're starved and now they have this virus. I would probably leave too. But they also found that higher quality pollens that have higher crude protein have more iron and calcium, and these particular minerals are really important in honeybee health. That actually they play a role in increasing honeybee health in the colony. So really neat information from this study. I also want to talk about water. And you might think, well, duh, without water, pretty much anything is going to die, unless you're like a chironomid little fly and they're just weird. But without water, bees will die. And it's really important that we consider water as one of the main nutrients that honeybees require. Water functions in carrying dissolved nutrients to all parts of the body. Inside a honeybee, under that exoskeleton, is a hemocyl. It's just a cavity filled with blood, and all the organs are sloshing around. So this water, which represents a large portion of the hemolymph or the honeybee blood, helps to carry nutrients to all sorts of tissues and organs. Also, water is really important in removal of waste in the excretory system of the honeybee. It also helps aid in ingestion and digestion of food. It helps to process nectar, dilute thick honey. And also larval food may contain, that is the mandibular and hypopharyngeal gland secretions, up to 66% water. So one thing I always ask people is, what do we really know about honeybees use their food? And we're starting to learn more and more. And some of this we learn from looking at other insects and how they use their food. But if we think about kind of the human gut, where a lot of research has been directed over probably the last decade, and it's actually where most health problems begin. There's more nerve cells, neurotransmitters in the gut, the entire nervous system. So pretty interesting. And a healthy gut is supposed to be lined with about 100 trillion bacteria. That's 3 pounds of bacteria. And the function of these bacteria is to help absorb nutrients from the food, to protect the gut lining, to help with metabolic breakdown, and also to help maintain weight. And so regulate weight. So helping in reducing the probability of obesity. Now, there's friendly bacteria in our bodies, but there's also unfriendly bacteria. If you've ever taken an antibiotic and your stomach starts to get a little ooey, you are killed probably a lot of your friendly bacteria and have opened the doors for unfriendly bacteria to grow. Now, many insects also have lots of friends in their digestive tract, not just us. So if we look at termites, termites are kind of the obvious one. They eat wood, and it's not easy to eat wood and break down wood. And they can't do it without the help of a microorganism that they house in their hindgut to help them actually get nutrients from this food source. So not all termites do it this way, but most termites have some type of internal symbiont. It's a protozoa in this particular one that's housed in the hindgut that actually helps feed on the wood, the cellulose, and then in return makes different vitamins and minerals for that particular termite to utilize. We also see these kind of gut mutualisms in plant feeding, sap eating insects or sap sucking insects. This is a scale insect here. It's a female, and this is actually a waxy protective coating that she has secreted as she's underneath this kind of ornamentation, sucking the sap out of this plant. Now, sap is really high in sugars, high in water, very low in protein, very low in vitamins and minerals. And so they house bacteria or yeast in their gut that specifically provide them with the things that sap is lacking. And it's providing these bacteria and yeast with this sugar, this high sugar diet. So it's pretty interesting that we can look at the same type of thing with pollen and also bee bread. So pollen collected from the flower and then actually converted to bee bread. So differences between pollen and bee bread. Bee bread contains more reducing sugars, vitamin K, lactic acid, unique enzymes, and microbes. Some of this work started in the 1950s, where they actually plated out bee bread and pollen onto agar, onto different plates, onto different growth mediums, and they actually could then isolate different groups of microbes. And they found 3 important genera, Lactobacillus, Pseudomonas, and Saccharomyces. And they found that each of these genera played important roles in helping to break down that really crazy strong exine or outer shell of the pollen grain, so that it could be broken down and converted to nutrients that the bees could actually utilize and that they needed in order to survive. So another thing, eggs, pupa, and emerging workers, like adults, when they emerge from their capped cells, are usually free of microbes, suggesting that they acquire these microbes via trophallaxis, or feeding from one to another, and or pollen that's been inoculated with these microbes. And I can tell you in all the other insect examples, they also have to inoculate themselves with these microbes. So the benefits of yeasts, well, we believe that these yeasts that are helping to convert this pollen to bee bread also create an essential source of proteins, lipids, and other necessary growth factors. And there was work looking at kind of mainly B vitamins found in bee bread when they were not found in the pollen before. So here's an interesting gut microbiome study from 2019, where researchers fed bees about a 50% sugar solution. Now, all the colonies got this 50% sugar solution, but one group got it with pollen, and one group got it with pollen and antibiotics, and one group just got the sugar syrup with antibiotics. Now, the bees that were fed the antibiotics did not grow or metabolize their food. They had a lower expression of genes for encoding proteins for royal jelly production, and were more vulnerable. Specifically, they looked at deformed wing virus. So that's really interesting. Now, if we look at what else they found in the study, when they were supplemented with pollen, they were actually able to recover some of the royal jelly components, and nutrient metabolism increased. They were able to gain weight and assimilate their food. So that's pretty amazing. And it's just like why doctors tell us when we take antibiotics to take probiotics so that we can help keep our guts healthy. So we're able to get the nutrients from our food and have a healthy gut. Now, another question I always have is, do bees have a food preference? They're like, oh, that's really high in crude protein. I'm going to just forage for that. Well, just like us, I can't say that I always pick the best foods to eat nutritionally. Sometimes it's just convenience, what's around. So what do we know about honeybees and food preferences? Well, here's a chart, and this actually is showing you some of our different kind of agricultural crops and the amount of crude protein in the pollen associated with these. Usually we say around this region in the 20s is probably, we would consider that high quality pollen. This study by Purnell and Curry in 2002 did choice tests. And in choice tests, these bees responded better to odors from real pollen versus pollen analogs or pollen mimics. Bees preferred pollen whose particle size was smaller than 50 microns, specifically below 45. So size was really important in terms of the bees kind of choosing that. Also, bees were able to kind of determine and discriminate protein content. Oh, excuse me, were not. That's the important part there. They were not able to. And there hasn't been a study that I've seen that has shown that bees were able to discriminate protein content, able to choose one pollen source over another because somehow they knew that one had a higher protein content. You would think that they would, but that has not been shown. Odor was the primary cue and selection force behind why a bee chose a pollen. So odor is really, really important. Odor, size. Also, they found that pollen choice was based on handling time. So now we're getting again at ease of being able to get the pollen. How much energy do they have to expend in order to gather the pollen? So I also did some work with Mount Cuba Center looking at the ecological role of flowering plants, really interested in whether different cultivars, plants of the same genus that were bred for different reasons, if their floral rewards differ. And this is important because it's important for us to know what we can plant on the landscape so that we can supply the best forage for not just honeybees, but for all flower visitors and insects that feed on floral rewards. So do cultivars of native plants provide the same ecological benefit for flower visitors? We looked at Coreopsis or tick seed. These are some of the different cultivars we tested. And we primarily looked at pollen differences within this genus. We also looked at monarda. And so this one, we really focused on nectar production. And we looked at 12, I think, different cultivars. And we really wanted to look at the quantity and quality of nectar in the monarda and pollen in the Coreopsis. In order to collect nectar, we used a microcapillary tubes and a little syringe bulb. And then we used a refractometer to get percent sucrose. We also collected pollen. We kind of caged the plants when they were producing pollen, and then we would sample the pollen from the anthers and bring it into the lab and process it, dry it, and then send it off for analyses. We also looked at floral traits from the different cultivars. So we could look at color, we could look at size, we could look at the size of the disc diameter, which is where all the pollen producing flowers are versus these ray flowers here. And just quickly, we did see differences. We saw, and these are all early season Coreopsis cultivars down here. So Coreopsis verticulata, Zagreb, full moon, etc. And we did see that mean, and this is bumblebees, visitor preference was different in terms of which ones they visited, Lacy lingerie being the preferred. We also found that honeybee visitation was different depending on the cultivar. And also this is late season Coreopsis species on both sides here. And this is honeybee visitation. So we did see a preference for certain cultivars over others, as well as mean wasps. So the mean number of wasps visitation on different cultivars of Coreopsis. So this gives you an idea of kind of which cultivars might you plant in order to attract different types of flower visitors to your yard. And here again for late season Coreopsis is bumblebees. Now looking at the monarda, we actually just did a quick kind of collection to see who were the primary visitors of monarda, and bumblebees, hands down, were definitely the primary visitors. And if we look at the frequency of visitation by bumblebees to monarda, we find that monarda fistulosa and the different cultivars that have been bred off of fistulosa, like Claire Grace and this purple mildew resistant cultivar, were the preferred visitors or preferred cultivars for bumblebees. So each one of these down at the bottom is a different type of monarda cultivar. Monarda citriodora is the straight species. Monarda digima is a straight species, and Monarda fistulosa is a straight species, meaning this is how they were found in nature. They have not been bred from that. Now looking at hummingbirds, you can see Monarda digima Jacob Klein is the preferred monarda for visitation by hummingbirds. And here we looked at sweat bee visitation. So these are halictids. And you can see these halictids, there was no difference in their preference among the different cultivars of monarda. And this is because actually they weren't visiting for nectar. They were visiting the anthers on the end of the flowers and were collecting pollen. Now this is kind of neat. The wool carder bee specifically went to Monarda citriodora and the cultivar Monarda citriodora bergamo. And this was specific because they were using it not only as nectar collection site, but also as a rendezvous site. So the females would collect nectar on these flowers and the males would guard the flowers because they were trying to woo the females. Now this is just looking at volume of nectar, sugar concentration of nectar, and crude sugar content. And you can see here certain straight species and their cultivars had a higher volume. So Monarda digima and the cultivars off of that had a higher volume than the others. If we look here, this is concentration of nectar, and it's there's no significant differences really between these across in terms of concentration of nectar. So similar amount of sucrose. And then also crude sugar content. Again, we can see here that the crude sugar content per flower is higher in this particular Monarda digima Jacob Klein. And this also is interesting. This is temperature outside and nectar concentration. And as temperature increases, the nectar concentration increases. And so this just shows you how weather patterns and how weather can play into floral reward quality. So as that water is going to evaporate from the nectar, the sugar concentration is going to increase. And this is just a fun little video of a carpenter bee visiting monarda. Oops, hold on, let me go back and see if I can get it to play. And you can see here, this is not really, I wouldn't say is a pollinator of monarda. I would say it is a robber because it's going to the base of each of those monarda flowers and digging a hole and drinking the nectar. So it's not actually coming in contact with the reproductive parts at all. So a fun little tidbit to leave you with, there's a study in 2019 and they found that honeybee brood powder, so this is kind of looking at the idea of insects as a cleaner, healthier protein source for humans, contains about 20 to 25% protein. And they ran an odor analysis on larvae and pupae. And the main compounds were life stage and diet dependent pheromones, those that were giving the odor. And then also they were described in terms of taste as milky and buttery. And I've actually had honeybee pupa before, and they are very milky, buttery, and I would even say sweet. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. All right, so the take-home message I would say is read, plant, and choose your apiary site wisely. You want to make sure that you are being a good steward for your bees and providing them with the diversity of plant species that are blooming all season long. So, and also make sure that they have enough food to get them through periods of dearth. All right, well, I guess I will answer questions later, and thank you so much for listening.